Pride goeth before a fall. That is just false pride. Pride is the deadliest of the deadly 7 deadly sins. Black pride, civic pride, pride in my work, protecting my pride, proud of them, proud of her, proud of him, proud of you, proud of me. What an interesting topic Sharon gave us in this Bid for Love service when she asked us to focus on the service in the ways that we struggle with the idea of pride today. The messages that we have in our culture are mixed in different ways, and they emerge in the ways that we talked about in our Time for All Ages, as that good kind of good feeling, proud feeling, and then that kind of vanity, prideful feeling that we can also feel. As someone who was raised outside of organized religion, it's always interesting to me how much of that traditional Christian mainstream, even the oppressive parts, filtered into my life somehow, even though I never had any formal schooling in it, in any kind of religious instruction as a child. I knew as a very young child that pride was something you should avoid, if possible. And yet, it has also been true that as I've seen growing understanding of the sense of pride that Rodney talked about in his call to worship, that there are also ways that we have recognized over these decades that it is actually important for us to hold some forms of being proud, and that's important. I think it's captured in that sense of the pride events that we have to celebrate our LGBTQI siblings each year. And in his 7 Deadly Sins podcast, Stephen Fry, the author and podcaster and actor, calls this use of the word a metonym, because it's so true, using pride in that sense. It's a metonym. It's not just a synonym, it's a metonym, he says. Now, in a sermon preached when he became the head of the UU Service Committee, my colleague William Schultz commented, the 7 deadly sins were first systematized in 590 by Pope Gregory, as Rodney alluded to, and now are part of the Catholic Catechism. I bet, he said, that unless you're an ex-Catholic or were very attentive and guilt-ridden by tendency in catechism class, most of you cannot name the 7 deadly sins. In fact, if I give you a hint, you might come up with one of them. It is associated with frequent church-going. And then he says, bless you, bingo, you've got it, lust. Though, come to think of it, he says, those of you who thought that the sin I was thinking of was low blood pressure may not be off the mark, because if you have low blood pressure, you may be feeling sloth. That's another one. And then there's wrath and greed and pride and envy and gluttony. The 7 deadly sins, he said, the early Christian church's roadmap to hell. He goes on then for the rest of his address to talk about the 7th and most deadliest being pride. And that's something that the writer and Christian apologist C.S. Lewis agrees with, and as far as pride is concerned. He wrote, there is one vice of which, and I'm going to use the language of his time, though it is not inclusive, there is one vice of which no man in the world is free, which every person in the world loathes when seen in someone else, and of which hardly any people, except Christians, ever imagine that they are guilty of themselves. There is no fault which makes a person more unpopular, and no fault with which we are unconscious of in ourselves, and the more we have it in ourselves, the more we dislike it in others. According to Christian teachers, this essential vice, this utmost evil, is pride. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, all of that are merely flea bites in comparison. It was, though, through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. Well, there you go. That's the dark side of Narnia, indeed. And there does seem to be a lot of consensus, as I've researched this over the last weeks, that not only is pride a sin, it's one of the deadliest for those who think in those manners. And as Stephen Pride put it, if the 7 deadlies are the banana peels of life, sure to make you slip into more and more mess and unholiness, then pride, as he puts it, is the most banana peel-ish of all of them. If you think about it, there's egoism and there's egotism, and what a difference a little t makes. Yet our world is ravaged by it in so many ways. And when you're thinking about the world through the lens of pride, as I have been these last weeks, you really realize this is something we need to figure out. The synonyms for pride show our very conflicted relationship to it: vanity, arrogance, snobbery, self-importance. And more recently, as Fry pointed out, we're more likely to also use other synonyms as we move away from a more theological, traditional understanding towards a more psychological one: self-love, affirmation, self-respect. Yet what our world is seeing today is excesses, perhaps, of the former kinds of synonyms and not so much the latter. So let's look a little bit about where this comes from. In the Jewish tradition, in the scripture of Micah, we are told that to love mercy, do justice, and walk humbly with our God is what we should aspire to do. And Rabbi Michael Dolgan says that it's about our will and our limits when we think about pride, the difference between the tree of knowledge of good and bad and the tree of life, which are both found in Genesis. He says they represent two basic issues in human life: our mortality and the limits in our knowledge. Many cultural and religious perspectives, he says, assert that wrestling with mortality defines the entire human experience. But the Torah story about the birth of humanity focuses not only on our struggle with mortality, but also on the limits of what we can know. In the Islamic tradition, they differentiate between the kind of pride that's rooted in arrogance and the humility that allows one to not only realize one's own limits before God, but also to realize one's limits in oneself. So perhaps, for some, the litmus test for which kind of pride we're experiencing has to do with whether it makes us feel like we know everything or just whether we're celebrating what we do know. That's something to think about. Fry points out that Aristotle was a great fan of a certain kind of pride, and that the Greek word for pride translates as greatness of the soul, which was my favorite definition that I encountered in preparing for this sermon. So perhaps the pride that we can actually be proud of is determined by the expansiveness of our motivation behind our actions and our interpretations. Do I do this for my own glorification and the uplifting, or for the uplifting of something larger? Perhaps world leaders sense this contradiction when they try to cast their personal ambitions in a cloak of betterment for a nation. In the Nyingma school of Buddhism, they differentiate between divine pride and delusional pride, and this is what actually the one that stuck with me as I looked at this. They said that divine pride or delusional pride is arrogance, the conceited attitude of superiority based in the belief in the fact that life is not transitory, that is the basis for disrespecting others and for the reoccurrence of suffering. That is where we see the world through the lens only of the I, or a my, and the idea that we are a totally separate, permanent self. So the mundane or delusional pride is linked to the delusional or unwholesome view in this form of Buddhism of separateness and permanence. Now, I was reading this particular article in Tricycle Magazine, which is a Buddhist magazine, when the NPR headlines about the January 6th hearings started coming up on my phone. And it struck me that this lack of understanding about our interdependence is rife in the motivations behind what happened that day. And this week, when we were forced once again to see those events, the slippery slope of delusional pride is very, very clear to us. One delusion, as these events make clear, is to overvalue yourself, but another is to undervalue yourself. This was the reason for Langston Hughes' I'm Black and I'm Proud, which has evolved into Black Lives Matter and other movements. It's the metonym of gay pride. And Fry points out that it is also behind the Helen Reddy, I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar, right? It is, Fry points out, reasons abound behind why a society that was hierarchical and predominantly paternalistic and based on fulfilling the desires of a very few people at the top would want to restrict how much people felt pride. For pride is tied to a sense of autonomy and also a freedom from the opinions of others at some level. And in some societies, that tie to the opinions of others is an important binding element. So perhaps it is divine pride when an act allows a person to take their rightful place, to let their own little light shine, not underneath anyone else, not above anyone else, but just right alongside the others. Some prideful acts bring people together, and others we know drive them further apart. An achievement by a member of the community might inspire others in the same way that claiming an identity might. A competitive kind of pride keeps people apart, and a toxic kind of pride can justify many things, even the loss of others' lives, as a way of saving face. Pride driven by arrogance inevitably sets one further apart from others. And national pride, this is an interesting thing that I spent quite a bit of time thinking about, but national pride seems really able to step on that banana peel and slide into other things, towards nationalism for one thing, while civic pride is more likely to just organize a trash pickup. Think about it, it's kind of interesting. If keeping people in their places in a hierarchical society makes pride the worst sin, then perhaps what we need in these times when we're trying to establish, many of us, a more egalitarian world, is a moderated pride which allows all to give their gifts, which is the motivation for many. And as Stephen Fry says, who are we to call this sinful? In today's world, we need all the little lights. We need to survive the fuss and mess of these days, and we need to take time to affirm ourselves and also to encourage others to do the same. We also need to be wary of the excesses of ego which endanger all of us on this planet. We need that greatness of soul, I believe, and we cannot afford the costs of more delusional pride that is so rending the world and its citizens. So let us, together, affirm that we will let our lights shine and that we will also, together in community, regulate among our own hearts those places where vanity seeps in. So may it be.